Guys, welcome back to the basement. Nathan, Bert, and I'm working on stuff. So, sorry about the delay. Been in a bit of a funk, building funk and whatnot, and it is cold as hell in my basement. So, but finally got down here, figured out how to put on a couple layers of clothes, and started working on some stuff. So I am working on a tactical cocker build that I've been wanting to do for a while, just kind of for shits and giggles. And went ahead and put the valve in and everything, and I am working on the rest of the internals. Was starting to work on the hammer lug, and I figured, you know what, let's go ahead and do a video on that. So I want to talk with you about how the different shapes of hammer lugs, how you can modify them, what makes a difference with the hammer lugs, and what difference does it make doing certain things to your hammer lug. So, as we all know, this is a hammer. This one in particular is a CCM. As you can see, poking out there, we've got our hammer lug. Now, we've talked about before, running that hammer lug either down or up a little bit further is what designates at what point in the trigger pull your marker is going to fire. Okay? So the further down it is, the further back you're going to have to pull the trigger in order for the sear to come down and the marker to fire. The further up it is, to a point that you still have a reliable catch anyway, the further forward in the trigger pull the marker's going to fire. So we're going to look at a couple things real quick. First off, just kind of pulled out my drawer full of internals and grabbed some stuff out. This is a hammer lug. That's what it looks like outside of the hammer. I believe these are something like a 1032 thread. I never actually checked the thread on a hammer lug, but this is a really standard, run-of-the-mill WGP standard hammer lug. Okay. Now we've got a couple others here. Let's see, we've got one like this. This is a rounded hammer lug. This more than likely would have come out of, say, a ShockTech fat hammer. They're the ones that are really famous for using rounded hammer lugs. And as you can see, like I said, the bottom of that is round instead of a squared off shoulder. So if we take a look at the two of those, you can kind of see the difference between them. Now, we're going to use just these two as an example, but what makes the difference? Why would you round off a hammer lug? So if we look at the equation here, okay, so our hammer, when the marker cycles back and recocks itself, our hammer catches by the hammer lug on the sear right here. So when you pull the trigger, sear rocks down. As soon as it clears the hammer, or as soon as the hammer lug clears it, comes forward, hits the valve, fires the marker. So with a standard square-shouldered, WGP spec lug, what that means is you have pretty much equal resistance right here, all the way down, and then you get a really sharp break. Okay, so this is not going to be like a squishy feeling release. It's not going to be a soft feeling release. It's going to be a real quick, snappy release when you fire that marker. With a rounded hammer lug, as you can see, about the probably bottom quarter or so of this is completely rounded off. So we're going to have equal resistance, and then when we get here, the force of your hammer spring combined with that hammer lug is going to kind of jump this over, which is going to make for a really soft, smooth release, okay, or firing point. Now, when it comes to hammer lugs, I am not a huge fan of rounded hammer lugs, minus the occasional pump build. The reason being, with a standard hammer lug, this is going to catch pretty reliably whether you're sitting up here and firing all the way at the back of your trigger pull, or you're sitting right down here at the tip. This is going to catch pretty reliably because you're working with essentially 290 degrees, just a completely straight on force here. So you have a really, really good chance of catching every time, which allows you to time your autococker with the firing point towards the front of the trigger pull, which is what I'm personally a fan of. Now with a rounded hammer lug, you can only time down to, say here, and have a reliable chance of catching. Anywhere down on this lower portion is not going to catch correctly. So these work pretty well for pump markers. In my opinion, I personally enjoy them in the occasional pump marker because they do make a nice, soft, smooth release. But for the most part, I don't particularly like these in mechanical cockers because I don't like having to run my hammer lug that far down. Now, as always, when we're talking about the way to set these up and the way these parts work together, that's why there's so many different ways to do this. Because everyone likes something a little bit different. You like a different feel to the way the gun shoots. So, there are a couple other variations. There are, for example, some, let's get a small pointy thing. There are some people have taken and made sort of an hourglass shape on the top, on the squared off point of the hammer lug. So we have kind of a triangle here, if you can imagine that. Now, what's the point in that? Anytime we're talking about friction surfaces, if you have two friction surfaces and it is possible to reduce the surface contact by, in this case, about half, if you can reduce the surface contact between the two friction surfaces, you reduce the potential for friction being made. Okay, so it's I think I've talked about it before, and we can talk about it some other time if it's not clear. But the whole point of making kind of an hourglass of that hammer lug is so that you have just the very tiniest tippity bit catching on that sear, and you have a very small bit that's actually riding up and down the sear. You've reduced a massive amount of surface contact, and thereby potentially reducing the friction as well. So, like I said, there's that variation. There's a kind of a funky one with the ShockTech gunfighter frames. Those are kind of a different animal. The sear is quite a bit different. The trigger action is different. We're dealing with a cantilever design, and honestly, in essence, with a gunfighter frame, you're almost working with two lugs. So you can. A lot of people will run a conical lug, or just a cone essentially as the bottom of their lug, running it to a point in those, because that way, if you have a 45-degree angle on this side and a 45-degree angle on this side, those angles will match, and you get a good solid lock while still being able to reduce the friction surface. Okay, now that's a different animal. The gunfighter frames, really cool tech if you want to go check them out. If you haven't checked them out, really interesting innovation here in the past couple of years. Pretty cool stuff. So I also wanted to cover just real quick, like I said, there's a ton of different ways to do these. Most important, in my opinion, just like we talked about when we were talking about the internals of a frame and how the surfaces work together, every friction surface that you can have in this marker, if you can put a high polish on it, you can reduce friction and give yourself a smoother pull. Now, like I said, you have to take each one of these, both the shape, the size of the lug, the surface polish, all of that contributes to how this marker is going to feel when you're shooting it, how that trigger pull is going to feel. So anything that you're going to go through this amount of time and reworking, it's a good idea to go ahead and put a good polish on it. You will see good results on the back end. So I wanted to cover just real quick as the last thing. I've messed with a bunch of guns. I've messed with all kinds of different lug setups, depending on what the customer wants out of the trigger pull. That's the nice thing, is you can completely customize the way that marker fires and the way the trigger feels just by reworking the frame, the springing, and the hammer lug. You can completely change the feel of a gun. So, personally, like I said, working through a tactical cocker that I've been wanting to build, so this is how I like to do my hammer lugs. Let's see if we can get it up close enough where you can actually kind of see. Not really. Fantastic. I wonder if I can focus. I can't. So it's kind of hard to see, but this is pretty well just a standard WGP spec hammer lug. But at the very tip here, and you can kind of see the shine coming off of it, at the very tip, what I'll usually do when I pull the hammer lug out is, I don't have a lathe laying around, but I do have a power drill, so I'll chuck it into the power drill, buzz it down with, if it's really, really crusty, maybe 220. If it's not so bad, we'll start at about 400, clean it up, and then I actually have a small triangle file here. And what I like to do is buzz about a 45-degree angle, a very, very shallow 45-degree angle on the very tip of this. And this has become really my favorite way to do these. It makes it to where you have a massive amount of range for adjustment, and you're still going to get a really good solid lock whenever you are looking for a cocking point. You're going to get a good solid cocking point for a large range of adjustment here. So whether you want it at the very front of the trigger pull or the very rear of the trigger pull, that's no big deal. You've got plenty of room. But when you do get to your firing point, right at the end, you get a good, smooth, quick release. So it's kind of a bastard child between a standard square-shouldered hammer lug and a rounded hammer lug, but just rounding the very, very tip of it. For me, this has become really my favorite way to do hammer lugs, especially in mechanical cockers. I have put it in a couple pump setups as well if you're looking for a really tight hair trigger kind of feel. Like I said, there's a ton of different ways you can do these, as with all the parts. So I just kind of figured I'd show you guys what I usually do. And of course, now that we've buzzed the 45-degree angle onto that particular lug, I'll chuck it back in the drill, and we'll step up to 6, 8, 1500, whole 9 yards. Make this really nice and smooth. I'm hoping to have this build done here in, I don't know, we'll see when it gets done. But that's pretty much where we're at. So, as always, if you guys have any kind of questions, there's anything I didn't cover well enough, or anything else you want to talk about, just let me know. Have a good one.